hear the stuff with the expectation I might not quite get every bit of it, but I really hope and pray that some part of it will help you on your journey. We have been talking about the subject that we believe Jesus raises, recorded in Matthew 24 as well as other bits. Really talking about the destruction of the temple about 40 years later, but also, is there a layer about the end of the universe? And we've had, it's been Douglas and Chris and I. You'll get to meet the matching Douglas and Chris, who've turned up with practically the same clothes this morning, and it's just amused me. I'm just going to put that out there. It's just amused me. There'll be matching boys on the sofa. So yes, matching girl. Oh yes, I'm a bit blue today as well. So what I think is important for us to understand is that our eschatology, our beliefs, however muddy, about the end of time or the future of the future, they actually form a lens. And that affects how we see God and how we interact with God. How close we can come to him, or do we hold him at a distance? And so this series has been important to bring up. You might feel a bit like, but really does it matter because it's away over there? But we believe it does affect things. So we've tried to give you lots of historical facts by Douglas, mainly. And I'll come on to why that was important. And we've talked about lots of different tools for approaching tricky passages of the Bible like this that you think, what? And we just wanted to open up conversation, really. Conversations with each other and in our groups and just between you and God, just to continue this conversation. Why bother doing it? Well, I shared in week 1 that God actually asks us to be searching for understanding. And it's a search that we don't do alone. It's this Trinity kind of experience where when we want to search spiritually, we find ourselves with Jesus because he's the only way to the Father. And we get the spirit of wisdom and understanding through Holy Spirit. So we've got this 3-in-1 happening. And what we know is that we are not to try and form our own little human understanding, our little logic box that goes, this is what that must mean. But God says, don't lean on that. That's not going to support any kind of weight. Come to me. I'm the source of understanding. And he says our approach needs to be inclining our ears and our heart, being crying out. It's an intentional action. I want to understand God for wisdom and understanding, whilst also being content to trust in the Lord when I'm not understanding. So it's a bit of an oxymoron, that one. We also have looked quite a bit at how we approach Scripture. I referred to a series that was done a couple of years ago as well on how to read the Bible. Douglas has done a learning stream and he's going to do another one. And so there's lots of stuff here about how do we approach the Bible. Here's some things we've looked at this time. Different types of writing. This is a collection of books with lots of different authors and lots of different styles, and we need to be aware of that. It's also written by different people. So we believe Scripture is inspired by God in the way in which it is recorded, and recorded for life. But we also believe that he is speaking through a human being. It is a human being. There's a partnership thing happening here, is what I believe. I don't believe that we're just zombies and God just kind of wrote through us, but that he chooses us and works with us to do stuff. And that's the same for the authors of the Bible. So one example of this is you might not want to approach the writings of King David, a man after God's own heart, messed up a bit, but came back. You might not want to approach his writings in the same way as his son Solomon. Huge gift of wisdom, but he had a massive problem. And that problem was his complete downfall, his separation from God. So when you come to the book of Proverbs, for instance, you could, if you want, read it as wisdom for all humans for all time. But you might also think Solomon had a problem. So when you come to the many warnings about foreign women, and if you look up the word for foreign, sometimes translated, I think wrongly, as adulteress, it doesn't mean adulteress, it means foreign. And that's because that was his problem. He kept marrying women who worshipped other gods. That's their definition of foreign. And you might see, okay, some of this is about Solomon. Because I don't need to worry about marrying a foreign woman. So that little word of wisdom isn't for me. Yeah? Do you see what I mean? So how we approach the Bible and how we think about it. We know warnings are huge in God's communication to human beings. There are so many warnings. Why are you laughing, Andrew McNutt? He's my husband, in case you're like, my goodness, that woman is so rude. I am quite rude. I quite like it. Lots and lots of warnings. Right, we've talked lots about symbolic language. Chris did such a great job last week about showing us about layers and repetitions and how to approach symbolic language. If you didn't see it, I thoroughly recommend that. And on the subject of layers, we also have prophetic language. And within prophecy itself, we don't just have literal, we have symbolic, and then we have layers. So you'll have words that we would classify as words of knowledge, and they would be stuff about their past and stuff about their present. There would be stuff about their immediate future. There would be stuff about within their generation. And then, in the middle of it all, there'd be these bits that popped up that were about a future messianic king, priest, prophet, that at the time, they must have been like, oh, I don't know what that bit's about. Layers and layers of stuff. To make it all worse, sometimes the God who created time and therefore stands outside of it, he's looking and he talks in the past tense through the prophet about something that's in the people's future. I kid you not. So there is these things. Chris said something along the lines of the revelation of God's perspective needs the spiritual search. It needs the spiritual insight, not the human thing that we might lean on. So we know when we come to our passage that there were definitely directions for those who were listening at the time. We know that. And then we know that these books, these Gospels, were published later. And they were published in their timeline for a reason. And so they were relevant. There's bits that are relevant to those who were listening later when this was published. And then there are bound to be words of popping up about future. How do we sort these layers out? And I would raise the point that at times God will lift out verses or passages out of their moment they were spoken to and into our moment that he's speaking to us about. A great example of this would be about 4 years ago, we got the story of Exodus, right? Through the famous Home series. And then we had the Isaiah, look, I am doing a new thing. For years, we didn't even bother changing that as our verse for the year because it was so relevant. Those words got us here. They just formed this impetus, this word from God. When they were spoken or when they were spoken about, were they about a little town in Scotland thousands of years in the future? No. No, you're all meant to laugh at that point. I just thought that was quite funny. It was like, Isaiah, I speak unto and Lithgow. No, they weren't. But he lifted them out and he made them relevant for our time. Yeah, so we've got to watch for them. So how do we sort out these layers? Well, one of the things we're trying to do in our tricky passage is look at what is relevant for those people at the time. And we needed the cultural, historical stuff. That's why there was lots of that. So that we could do that, so we could start to sift out these kind of layers. And that helps us a bit with thinking about what might be one layer and what might be another. So I want to go back into Matthew 24, and I want to ask some questions of the passage, if that's okay with you. As a kind of rounding it up, I am asking questions of the passage, but my bias might become a little bit apparent. I apologize. I'm just stealing Chris's legal disclaimer from last week, which was excellent. But that's okay. You do not have to agree with me. It's the beautiful thing about this church. We're just trying to stir up you to think for yourselves. We know, well, most people consider the writer of Matthew to be the disciple of Jesus, Matthew. So we know this is a first-hand account. He is there at the time listening to the words. So it's a historical account. And Jesus has just warned, quite a long speech. He's just warned these religious leaders. And he ends his warning, woe to you speech by saying, all of the wrong, and it was considerable, all of the wrong that you were doing, and all of the wrong that the generations of Jewish leaders before you have done is all going to fall on you in your generation. It's time. I was thinking as we were singing this morning about the cross, and I was thinking just how Jesus came to the Jews, but he died for everybody. He died for absolutely everybody. And just this sense of that action opened up the way for the simplicity of anyone who believes. Anyone who believes can come to Jesus, that we're freed from, you have to be a certain person doing certain things in order to achieve righteousness, in order to be right with God. It just kind of hit me afresh this morning. So he's dropped the mic on, within a generation, you're in trouble. And he's walking through the temple grounds. And that's when he says his famous statement to them that the temple is going to be demolished. Stones are going to fall. Is he talking literally or symbolically? You can interact with me, by the way. You can be like, "Ooh, I think in the last 3 weeks, we've kind of figured out it was literal," because we've gone into history and we know that the historians tell us that that's literally what happened. But it's a really valid question because there was another time when he used the temple as a symbol for his body. But this time it seems to be literal. About 40 years later, it is all going to come down. This literal, the temple being destroyed and the Jewish system with it and what that would mean, this is the subject matter of the disciples' question. They haven't walked away, sat down, and started up a fresh conversation as far as we can see. So we're going with the much more logical plan that they are asking about his incredibly shocking statement that the temple's coming down. Tell us when all this will happen. Well, all what? We think it's the temple. What will be the signal of your return? Well, good question would be, what return? What kind of return are we talking about here? Good questions to ask. I don't have the full answer on that. But what I do know is the subject matter is still... No? Shout out to me. Anybody? The temple. Thank you, Linda. The subject is still it's the same sentence. They've not even paused and had a cup of tea. So we can we would lean towards it being still talking about the temple, and therefore are they assuming, well, Jesus will have to come and do something? There's not actually an indication in there that it is talking about death, resurrection, and a return. There's just the word come back. So it's a tricky one, that one, but there you go. There's a good question to ask it. Douglas introduced us to how vital this temple system was and to their Jewish system. And therefore, we might ask the question of the passage, well, how will it function if the temple's destroyed? How will it work? And again, the historians are useful here because what we can see in history is that they never functioned the same ever again. It was the end of how they functioned within their Jewish system. It was the end of an age or an end of their world, as Chris put it well. It's the end of their world as they know it as Jews. So when they, within the same sentence, say, and the end of the age, we might ask, or the end of the world, what age are we talking about here? Is it related to the temple still? Well, that's one possibility. Or are they asking a completely unrelated question about the end of the universe? It'd be a bit weird, wouldn't it? But these are useful questions to ask. And Jesus' answer is full of those warnings and instructions. It seemingly has a timeline. Let's read that and then ask it some questions. It says, I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, common symbols for the temple, heaven meeting earth. But my words won't pass away. So is it a literal or a symbolic timeline? Nobody? Douglas? Oh, right. Okay. We could bring that up in the Q&A. Is it? Well, I would say that history would show us that a generation was considered about 40 years. And what is going to happen 40 years later? The temple's going to fall down. So, personally, and you do not have to agree with me, Keith Short, I think he is talking about this timeline. Let's just go back with that lens. Let's give it a shot and see if it makes sort of sense. Let's go back to the warnings. Are there records of false messiahs in the 40 years? Yes. Historians will tell us there were lots of false messiahs that came, even doing things like taking people out to the desert, which was part of what Jesus talked about. Lots of them. Were there wars and famines and earthquakes? Yes, and I know there still are wars and famines and earthquakes, but there was wars and famines and earthquakes within that 40 years. Some of the earthquakes are even recorded in the New Testament. Here's an important one. The gospel of the kingdom will be preached to the whole world. That one stumps us a bit, doesn't it? It's a bit tricky. So let's come back to, who is he talking to at the moment? He's talking to his disciples. Is he talking about a world, a discovered cultural, world when we're living now? Or at the end of the universe? Or is he answering their question, when will the end come? And therefore, is he actually talking about their civilized world? It's a good question to ask the passage. Their discovered world at the time. Well, Paul did think so. Paul talks about in Romans 10 and here in Colossians 1:6 that the good news that came to you is going out all over the world and is bearing fruit everywhere. So if the answer to our question is he's talking about their world at that time, then we do have some evidence that Paul, writing closer to 70 AD, is testifying to the gospel going out to all their civilized world. The desolation in the temple is another marker for them. Possible timeline marker. When you see, yes, Hilary, quote it. Luke 21 is another record of Jesus' conversation right here, right now with these disciples. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by the armies, you'll know the desolation is near. And Douglas gave us some examples of what that desolation could look like. It affected the temple, and you could go back and look at them. So which armies? Were there armies that surrounded Jerusalem? Did it happen, Douglas? Oh, yes, it did. Whose armies were they? They were the Romans' armies who, interestingly, made the vulture, the live vulture, a mascot for their armies, which I found an interesting point. So, we might ask questions like, so is one layer of understanding or one layer in Matthew 25's parables, was one layer of it practical information about them getting ready to have to flee? Invest your money. You're going to lose everything, so be ready. Have enough. I'm just putting that out there. One layer. Remember the layers. According to the historians, the Christians fled Jerusalem. They believed these words were for you and I. Oh, goodness, are you guys asleep this morning? I'm working the room. No, they didn't. They believed these words were for them. And that's another little indication to us. They followed it to the letter and got out. And then we move into the immediately. Another timeline marker is the word immediately. You don't say immediately if it's going to be thousands of years in the future. You don't, do you? Immediately. And he shifts into the symbolic language that's all about this massive shift in power that's going to happen. And you've got all this language around Jesus returning, coming to do this stuff, to take the temple down. And it's all language of war. There's no floating on clouds kind of meeting him. It's war, it's lightning, it's destruction. And actually he quotes Isaiah, who was talking about the Babylon destruction thing with the same language. This war-like God is coming in judgment on a people. Which should be noted. Douglas and Chris, get up in your matching outfits and sit on this sofa. Hilary McNutt, she's always bossing men about. So let's remember the layers to the prophecies, the repeating and the building picture, because there are other accounts of Jesus returning that have different language around it. And if we merge all of this into one great big second coming prophecy, what we've learned is that it gets really confusing and problematic, and the Christians have struggled and fought about it for years, which is a sign to you that we have not got that quite right yet. So we need to keep sorting out the layers and keep searching. And you all say, yes, we do. I'm not going to spill my water on the stage. I'm not going to do it, Andy. Thank you so much. We are coming to our Q&A. Who's excited about our Q&A? Oh my goodness. It's genuine excitement about the Q&A, and I just need to switch screens. Oh, trying to connect. Oh, that's not good news, is it? I can't see anything. I can't read the question. Could one of you read the question?
I have it printed out.
Thank you. Oh no, I found it.
Go ahead.
Okay, because we do have an order here. We have a plan. Right, first question that we are asking, that someone is asking. Thank you very much for all your questions. I mucho appreciate it. In the first sermon of the series, I, Hilary, stated that Matthew 24:29 should be understood symbolically, not literally. She cited Isaiah 13:10 in support of this, not clear why it's symbolic. Other verses, 2 Peter 3:10, Peter does not seem to be writing in a symbolic or poetic fashion in this verse. Another verse is Revelation 6:12-13, although Revelation is full of symbolism. And then we've got Joel 2:10. This is a great question. Someone knows their Bible. And if it's symbolic, what is it symbolic of? Commentary suggesting it's referring to the destruction of atmospheric heavens. Oh, that's a big word. Is it the same thing, Chris?
That's a very good question. I'll have to think about that. So I touched on this question by accident in my own sermon. So cosmic imagery like the sun going dark and the stars falling is common in apocalyptic literature. And it doesn't necessarily describe the end of the world. Isaiah 13 describes the fall of Babylon in cosmic terms, but when the fall happens in Daniel 5, just towards the end, it's one sentence long, it's very matter-of-fact, and he never mentions it directly again. So it suggests that it's a shift of power. So these kind of cosmic descriptions suggest this kind of language describes world-changing events, not world-ending events. But 2 Peter 3 is talking about the day of the Lord, the second coming of Christ. So it says, the heavens will disappear with a roar, the elements will be destroyed by fire. Throughout Revelation, we see similar language, and in Joel chapter 2, which I think is partly fulfilled in Acts 2, with the kind of Spirit being outpoured, its full meaning may extend to the end times. So, does all this symbolic language refer to political shifts and the fall of human empires? Well, in some cases, yes, we can say that because they happened and the sun is still shining. But prophecy can be layered, as Hilary was saying. So it can describe subjective experience. It can describe spiritual events. In human imagery, it can also refer to actual catastrophe, and it can be fulfilled more than once. There's this thing called the hermeneutics of multiple fulfillment, that prophecy can be fulfilled repeatedly, more than one time in more than one way. So because God's not limited to one time in one way. So until it happens, we can't say with certainty. So what I would suggest is whenever we read apocalyptic texts, we approach them with humility. When Jesus was on earth, fulfilling prophecy about himself, he didn't do it in a way anyone expected. They were expecting a lion. What they got was a sacrificial lamb. The broad strokes are mostly clear. Jesus is going to return, evil will be dealt with, creation will be renewed. But exactly how that's going to play out, and what are the finer details, I would recommend holding on to those things lightly. Because it may very well be that Jesus' second coming will not turn out the way you expect, much like the first.
Excellent. And another question related to this is 1 Thessalonians 4:13-18. How literally should we take this, Douglas?
I'm going to answer that in the reverse order that I've written the notes down. All that we've talked about so far in terms of times and schedules and what it means and all the rest of it. All these passages are in a wider context where the main point is, I've written it down, that the work we do for God is never useless. It's eternal. When we feel insignificant in world events, every little act of love by the least person to help out the least other person is of eternal matter. You are serving Jesus, and it lasts. It is important. When you feel insignificant and vulnerable to world events, all these prophecies are emphasizing that fact that everything we do is eternal. Love matters. Jesus cares about it. So everything that we say is working towards that goal. And if we lose that goal, we've lost the point. But to come back to the specific question about 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 and 18, how do we take it literally? I will refer to the globe of biblical truth. Now, in Revelation, it talks about God sending the angels to the four corners of the earth. There's no corners in a globe, but we don't say a globe is unbiblical. Matthew 24 talks about angels going to the four winds to collect people. We don't have a meteorological discussion. And in 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul's talking about the dead as being asleep. We all treat dead people and sleeping people differently. Even those who say they want to take the Bible literally will not take these passages literally. And when you have a debate about what you take literally, and then you point out to people who are really keen that all the Bible's literally, say, well, where are the four corners of the earth then? The conversation is very, very difficult. As to how to interpret this passage, we'll come back to that when we answer another question about the rapture.
So one of the questions we were asked was, what happens with the second coming? Will cremation cause problems? No, it's a legitimate question. It's a genuine question, and it's a good one. It's very interesting. So the second coming in Orthodox Christianity is the return of Jesus in glory to judge the world, both the living and the dead, and establish an eternal kingdom here and the renewal of all creation. Passages describe the dead being resurrected, receiving new bodies and facing judgment according to their faith, deeds, and the state of their heart. So for reference, that would be John 5, 28 to 29, 1 Corinthians 15, 52, Matthew 25, 31 to 46, and Revelation 20, 12 to 15. So in regard to cremation causing any problems, personally, I don't think so. The Bible has no burial rites or instructions dictating how bodies are supposed to be disposed of in regards to ensuring resurrection. There are rules around how you handle a body and dispose of a body, but they're around ritual purity, hygiene, and dishonorable treatment, mostly in Leviticus. I think the church at one point did discourage cremation, but that's because of an association with pagan rituals, not because it affects resurrection. Resurrection is described as an act of divine power. So in 1 Corinthians 15, 42 to 44, so will it be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable, it is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, and it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. This passage describes that the body is transformed, not just reassembled from its original matter. And keep in mind, most bodies throughout history have been completely destroyed, mostly just through natural decay. So if God is all-powerful and could create man from the dust, he can recreate man from the dust if he wanted. But this is a matter of personal conviction. If you feel strongly that you should be buried and not cremated, or the other way around, or you don't have strong feelings about it, it's entirely up to you. It's not a problem.
I think we should probably move on to the next question. Douglas has stuff as well to talk about that. And oh, excellent. You guys are on it. You should wear the same thing more often. Another question that we got in is, now this is a serious question. What is the general consensus about belief in the rapture if there is a rapture, and if there is New Testament scripture to support the eschatological event, another big word. Douglas.
Okay, I'll answer the last bit first. The scriptures that are used to support the idea of the rapture are Matthew 24, Mark 13, the aforementioned 1 Thessalonians 4, also 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 Timothy 4, 2 Peter 3, and most of the book of Revelation. Really oversimplifying 2,000 years of debate, there are three main interpretations of these passages put together. Each of these views has people who support it today. So that answers, there is no total consensus about this interpretation. So first we'll start with Origen of Alexandria, who lived 184 to 253 AD. He said all these passages are allegorical. They're pictures to describe the spiritual journey of individuals and of the church. Later on, you get Eusebius of Caesarea, 260 to 339. He says, nah, these passages describe actual events, that Jesus is going to come back, the dead Christians will be raised, the Christians will be taken up to heaven, and then 1,000 years later, God will return, Jesus will return in glory and judgment. Later on, in the 1800s, a guy called John Nelson Darby, 1800 to 1882, he rebranded this whole idea as the rapture and added all sorts of ideas to it and made a nice distinct package. But basically, he's copying Eusebius of Caesarea. The people who, so basically, this idea is Christians go up into the sky, Christian dead people get raised from the life, then 1,000 years later, there's a split. Some people say that after the Christians go up to the sky with Jesus, they come down and rule the world for 1,000 years before it ends. And other people say Christians go up in the sky with Jesus, and then there's 1,000 years of no Christians. And then later on, you get Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 430, who says that on one day, the dead are raised, Jesus comes in his glory, judges the world ends, one event. Most Christians in the world are in churches holding that view. The whole rapture thing tends to be associated with a small group of evangelicals, but they're very well funded and very good at getting their message across. The debate about how you interpret these continues. However, there is no debate about the fact that we should love each other.
Before you carry on that, as we're coming to the end of our Q&A, we would say that we'll gather around this bit, the three of us, and if you have other questions that you just want to have a chat about stuff, we're really happy to just make a little huddle, and Andrew's going to go and get us coffees, aren't you? And it'll be great. There was a question also, and the band are going to come up now, and the boys are going to go back now. There was a question